Dr. Stephanie Wakefield is an urban geographer whose work analyzes the philosophical, technical, environmental transformations of urban thought and design in the 21st century. She is currently assistant professor of urban planning and environmental design in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Florida Atlantic University. She is the author of Miami in the Anthropocene, Urban Resilience and Rising Seas, University of Minnesota Press, 2025, Anthropocene Backloop, Experimentation in Unsafe Operating Space, Open Humanities Press, 2020, and co-editor of Resilience in the Anthropocene, Governance and Politics at the End of the World, published with Routledge in 2020.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Joshua, for the talk. Thank you, Donna, for the invitation to come to the IC. Thank you, Jean, as well, and everyone in the seminar who, for the last few days, thought about some of the things I'd like to talk about today. Together. I really appreciated meeting you all. It was really a pleasure. I was fortunate to have spoken at the ICA before. I think it was in 2017. I gave a talk here on similar themes, actually, on Anthropocene art, climate change. And after that talk, a gentleman emailed me and said it was the worst talk he had ever heard in his life. And so I hope this one will be just as good. What I'd like to do today is think a little bit about the last decade. And this will repeat some of the themes in the seminar, but hopefully to go a little further from that. What I'd like to do is think about the last decade, this sort of outpouring of climate change and ecology-related art and theory that we have seen really take the academy and the cultural spheres sort of like by storm. I've written a lot about this before and said a lot of these things before, but I want to kind of look at that decade with a little bit more hindsight now. You know, kind of like step away and say, like, what was that? Okay, because I think we just saw like a strange phenomenon in that outpouring and that attention to all this sort of like climate apocalypticism and entanglement theory and this sort of thing. I'd like to kind of think about that in a new context, maybe in order to help us go somewhere else beyond it. So I think there will be a lot of interesting connections between Joshua's talk and my talk that I hope you will see and find interesting. So in the past decade, climate and ecology-related art and theory have really taken a central place in academic, institutional, and cultural discourse. Since the 2010s, especially around 2011 or so, there's been like a sustained cascade of exhibitions, interventions, texts, media programming devoted to sensing and representing climate chaos, climate collapse, climate emergency, and climate mourning. A lot of this work has coalesced around a surprisingly similar set of aesthetic and conceptual tropes, dystopian kind of installations, speculative fiction and visualizations, and theoretical texts, which overall emphasized the human, and specifically Western man, and his hubris as the root of impending planetary collapse. Artworks often featured ruined landscapes or crumbling landscapes, data visualizations of things like melting ice caps, or performative eco-rituals, which were in many ways trying to get to a new form of subjectivity. So the emphasis in a lot of theory and a lot of art within this sort of decade that I'm describing was on trying to forge a new more than human collectivity that would replace Western man, seen as the cause of these crises, and emphasizing the precarity and fragility and vulnerability of collective entangled life in a time of ongoing disaster. So in Anna Singh's words, anthropologist Anna Singh's words, the task of this art and theory, by and large, was perceived and expressed as the need to learn to dwell in capitalist ruins. So we might think, you know, just as some examples to kind of get back in this headspace of what is this art that we're talking about, we might think of Olafur Eliasson's work here, Ice Watch. So this was an installation in many city squares that brought in pieces of a glacier from a fjord in Greenland in public plazas to kind of express this idea of a clock. They were laid out in a clock formation to express this idea of like time is running out, right? Climate action is needed. These were timed to coincide with things like the UN Climate Conference, COP21 in 2015, the UN IPCC's fifth assessment report on climate change in 2014, amongst other large climate change policy gatherings. And in the artist's words, this work was designed to, quote, raise awareness of climate change by providing a direct and tangible experience of the reality of melting Arctic ice. And in the artist's statement, they said that this is meant to make climate change tangible and emotionally resonant. Quote, you can see it melting, you can hear it making noise, it helps make numbers relevant, end quote. And so this work was displayed in video and images that sort of showed people sort of touching the ice, kissing the ice, sort of like mourning this ice, or kind of like, you know, this wonder at the natural world. In a similar vein, kind of keeping with this glacier and mountain theme, we might also think of the Norwegian artist Christian Huge's 2016 to 2020 series, which was called Death of a Mountain. And for this, he draped the Rhone Glacier in Valais, Switzerland, in a shroud of UV-resistant blankets to protect it from human-induced melting. It was described in the press release as an homage to an ancient giant, as if tens of thousands of years culminated into an organism's last breath of life. Scientists warn that the world's glaciers will be gone within the century if we don't reduce global warming dramatically. By covering parts of the Rhone Glacier in Switzerland with UV-resistant fabric to halt glacial melting, this work also represents man's feeble attempt to stop the inevitable in the near future. The blankets were described as a death veil, war-torn ruins, still objects, or wet bodies covered with cloth, a visual of beauty and decay. That's another image of it. So alongside these kinds of works that were emphasizing the melting or disintegrating of a particular set of, let's say, climate relations, you also had the kind of work that I think that Joshua was gesturing to a lot in his presentation, this sort of work looking at ecosystems, entanglement, and these biological processes of decay. So we might think in this vein, along the lines of multi-species, more than human entanglements. Daniel Lai's show at the New Museum, I believe it was in 2022, which was this installation of ropes and mud seeded with spores, hay bales, flowers that were just left there to like disintegrate and decompose. And this was the exhibition itself. I included the press release or the artist statement here because I thought it was just, it's part of the work actually. And this is something I'll say in a minute. These statements that accompany these works were very much part of this climate and ecological art phenomenon. Very often you would see an interplay in these kinds of works between academic theory texts, books, artist statements, and even events surrounding these works. So in this sense, Anna Tsing's, again, The Mushroom at the End of the World, which Joshua also spoke about, was incredibly influential for the last decade. It came out in 2015, 2016, and it was repeatedly cited and quoted in artist statements accompanying shows like this. And in her book is very much about like turning away from the figure of the modern Western individual toward these multi-species entanglements and really trying to attune the reader or the viewer of a work like this, to sort of meditate on and sense what she calls the riotous colors and smells that thrive in disturbed landscapes, making them a model of dwelling in ruins, which was described as a task for us in the Anthropocene. Along with this, we also saw a veritable deluge of artistic pieces that depicted the inundation of cities, so the submergence of cities from rising seas. And of course, in Miami, we've seen more of these than any other place in the world, probably, because Miami has been the subject of so many of these. So this is Beeple, his installation that was from the Miami Art Week in 2023, displayed at the Faena. It's a sculpture depicting a city submerged in water, where people live inside these vertical towers. And it's sort of like this future world, he described it, where sea level rise has forced people to move into these dwellings underwater, but they remain resilient. These are his words. Ultimately, this trope of the flooded city, the city submerged by rising seas, finds its sort of like culmination in the city without us, the world without us imagery. So this is a still from the film Prologue, Tropical Malaise by Domingo Castillo, who who I will say every time I talk about his work, he's the greatest artist from Miami and the greatest artist of the Anthropocene in Miami, I think. This film, it depicts Miami Beach from a particular set of coordinates 5,000 years in the future. And so I'll come back to this film in a minute, but what you see in it is these undulating waves, waves upon waves. A little bit of trees popping up out of the waves, no people, no city, no nothing. It's a world without us, a future without us. And in many ways, within these tropes that we saw sort of circulating in theory and in art over the last decade, these images were not just perspective or projections thinking about what climate change might do. In some ways, we might read them also as aspirational, the world without man, the world without the human, in some sense. You know, art and artists have, for a very long time, forever, engaged with nature, right? We might think, you know, keeping with the glacier theme, we might think of the landscape painting of the Russian artist Nicholas Roerich in this vein. He was a 3-time Nobel Peace Prize nominee. He was not only a painter, he was a mystic, an explorer, a geographer, an archaeologist, and probably a spy. And he painted hundreds upon hundreds of luminous, mystical, metaphysical paintings of the Himalayas, amongst other landscapes. And in these, we see a feeling and a search maybe for some kind of metaphysical height, some kind of metaphysical journey. And I'll come back to these as well. And we might think of the land art movement as well, which, you know, took on its own relationship with nature. However, I think we want to distinguish the nature and ecology and climate change related art of the past decade from previous engagements with art and nature. What we see now is, and what we have seen over the last decade, is a turn to an ideological presentation of nature and engagement with nature. In fact, a didactic one, in which art is used as a tool, in other words, for communication and education. So at a first level, this style of art and theory is really focused on something very basic, you know, educating the public. And this is often what you hear in the sciences. This is how you hear a lot of scientists think of art. It's a tool for communicating risk. So art is used to communicate and visualize crisis, raise awareness, and ultimately petition like policymakers and governments to conduct a set of actions around climate change response, to communicate vulnerabilities and so forth. But at a second pedagogical level, as I've already been kind of insinuating, these works are also mobilized as a means of identifying the source of and solution to climate crisis as it has been defined. When we hear about global warming, it's often described as a war, or even the need for a wartime mobilization. But what is often said is that this is a strange war because it's a war without any kind of enemy or a clearly identifiable foe. But this is actually not the case. If we look at the climate change in ecology kind of art nexus, what we see is a clear identification of the enemy and the foe, and that is, again, the modern individual, the Western subject, or maybe even the Western mentality, that is identified as the source of the crisis as both environmental and ontological. It was this particular relationship to the world, it is said in these works and insinuated in these works, that has led to crisis, and it is overcoming this figure of man and this relationship to the world that's required to stop climate crisis or live with it. And so again, we might think of the work of Anna Tsing or Bruno Latour or Timothy Morton or Donna Haraway or many other thinkers in this kind of vein who were very influential in shaping artistic imaginaries. And there was really an interplay between the arts and theory during this time. And what was very interesting, I think, is that we can look back and see there was a deliberate kind of call in the beginning of the 2010s to make art and culture, to mobilize it in the service of this new kind of figure of life, this entangled kind of more than human life. So in Latour's very influential Gifford lectures from 2013, he makes this very explicit. And these were kind of at the outset of the fervor around the Anthropocene. He delivered these, and it was like this really interesting moment where Latour was obviously himself deranged by discovering this idea of the Anthropocene and climate change. And, and he's like suddenly reading Carl Schmitt and talking about war and all these things, and he's gone kind of nuts. I mean, there are many of these lectures, and they were very influential, cited very often within the cultural and academic world subsequent to his delivery of them. They later became the book Facing Gaia. In them, he says, we need to cultivate a new kind of human. He says that the Anthropocene is a situation of war. It's a war environment. It's a war between two figures of life. The modern human, like the Western individual, and the earthbound. And he says that it's a battle between the sort of like outdated human that is the source of the situation that we're in, and the earthbound, which would be an entangled subjectivity that is interconnected in loops with its environment, that doesn't seek to go beyond the pillars of Hercules. It doesn't have as its motto, as did the outdated human, plus ultra, going beyond, but instead plus intra, entangled within interconnections of the more than human world. And this is the attitude that has to be cultivated. And so he says very explicitly, we have to cultivate this attitude. We must educate our soul to a willingness to let itself be affected by the mere thought of possible fortunes and calamities of future generations, so that the projections of futurology will not remain mere forward for idle curiosity or equally idle pessimism. Therefore, bringing ourselves to this emotional readiness, developing an attitude to the stirrings of fear in the face of the merely conjectural and distant forecasts concerning man's destiny, a new kind of sentimental education. This is the preliminary duty of the ethic we're seeking. And he says then later that we need to put art and culture and thought in the service of this task. Right? So this is, these ideas were really circulating in a lot of works published 2013, 2014, 2015, 2016. Latour's Down to Earth, again, developing this idea of the earthbound as the form of subjectivity that must be taken on in the Anthropocene. This idea of the pluriverse, a world of many worlds, also kind of stemmed from a similar idea that the modern Western idea of the individual has to be overcome by understanding that there's not one world, but a world of many worlds, a plurality of worlds, which ironically are often described in the same way, in a very homogeneous way, as entangled, horizontal, not vertical, not hubristic. The Mushroom at the End of the World, Post-Human Knowledge by Rosie Braidotti, all of these centered around a similar argument. As Isabel Singers put it in an interview with Bruno Latour, we, the human, are a power of disturbance, not a force of anything. Latour responding, no more agents of history. We all agree on that. Rosie Braidotti actually was an interesting thinker in this kind of nexus of concepts and ideas, because she kind of took the idea of the earthbound a little bit further. Here in this work, Post-Human Knowledge from 2019, so she's forwarding this idea, building on Latour and on Bateson and this more than human assemblage thinking of the post-human. And she says, it's important to remember that this life that the post-human subject is imminent to is no longer bios, but zoe. Where bios is anthropocentric, zoe is non-anthropocentric and even non-anthropomorphic. Moreover, in the post-human convergence, zoe embraces geologically and technologically bound egalitarianism, acknowledging that thinking and the capacity to produce knowledge is not the exclusive prerogative of humans alone, but is distributed across all living matter and throughout self-organizing technological networks. And this is a figure of life that she's proposing as aspirational and ultimately natural, right? We've been delusional, is very much the idea in a lot of this thought. We've been delusional to think that we are the modern so-called human, the Western subject, capable of ordering the world, capable of going beyond the pillars of Hercules. This was a phantasm. In reality, this is life. So what's very interesting when you look back on this decade of this kind of art is you see that it really has, as in Latour's statement about war, a militaristic tone. It really was sort of a wartime environment and tonality. And this was made quite explicit in some writing around climate change and art. So around the same time as Latour's lecture in 2015, the New York art critic and activist Yates McKee offered a parallel program for ecology-related art. He said in an essay called "From Eco-Art to Biopolitical Struggle," we had reached a metabolic rift, quote unquote, where ecology could no longer be treated as just one topic among others in art. Ecology had become the terrain of a general biopolitical struggle against capitalism, racism, and colonialism, one that should structure the entire horizon of avant-garde art and life. And he goes on to critique previous artists who engaged with nature, including even Agnes Denis, who would think of as like a forerunner of nature protest art. She was called out for being cleansed of political antagonism and blind to race and class in his article. In contrast, McKee championed explicit leftist activism and militantism, the Yes Men, the Black Panthers, Occupy Museums, and Naomi Klein. He called Hurricane Sandy in New York itself a climate strike, and argued that art must be integrated into the politics of life as active engagement in dismantling capitalist structures. Ultimately, between these works of art, these kinds of installations, these academic works, these activist writings, all of this circulated, in many ways, I think, kind of coagulated into what we might call an apparatus, in the sense of the word used by Michel Foucault, sort of like assemblage of statements, visuals, gestures, practices that became more than the sum of its parts, that generated a particular tonality and style and aesthetic. But I don't think that necessarily helps us understand it, right? So what I'm very interested in still is, how do we understand what happened this last decade? Why was there such a circulation of similar themes? What was it? What did it mean? And what can we make of it? And there's one way we might understand it, is as what the art critic Dean Kissick has called, with reference to Tom Wolfe's essay of the same name, the painted protest. With this term, Kissick was describing the transformation of aesthetic expression, over the last decade into a vehicle for protest and a medium for the veneration with non-Western identity, marginalization, and social justice that, in his words, consumed the arts and culture of the past decade, especially since 2017. Kissick's essay was the cover story for Harper's in December of 2024. And he described the last decade as follows. Every major biennial I have visited over the past 8 years, from Germany to Greece, Italy to the United States, Brazil to the UAE, has taken as its themes the deep richness of identity and the rejection of the West. These biennials have embraced overlooked artists from the 20th century and exhibited recycled junk, traditional craft, and folk art. Their press releases have heralded the reclamation of pre-colonial forms of knowledge, like indigenous thought and magic. Art, which had previously been a way to produce discursive polyphony, aligned itself with the dominant social justice discourses of the day, with works dressed up as protest and contextualized according to decolonial or queer theory, driven by a singular focus on identity, end quote. And he also cites Tom Wolfe's line from his own original essay of the same name. In a museum of the future, you will find a painting, say, 3 inches square, accompanied by a wall of words, 6 feet high by 12 feet long, which will be the true museum exhibit. The painting will merely be an illustration for the text. So I think, it's possible, I think quite easy to see the parallels between what Kissick is describing with this essay and the mobilization of climate and ecology-related art as a sort of like didactic medium. And I think this is one way we can understand it. Kissick's essay is maybe useful for us too, because it's sort of like, it forms sort of like a marker ending maybe the last decade. It was received very well, this article. It was considered sort of like, an indicator of the vibe shift away from maybe this kind of like didactic style of art. And so we might think of it also as a place marker for closing the decade of Anthropocene art. Very interestingly, The Anthropocene and climate change and all this, they were very fashionable over the last decade in the cultural and academic spheres. But more recently, I think there's been a bit of a decline of these themes. The Anthropocene itself was rejected by the International Commission on Stratigraphy as a real geological epoch, not considered valid to actually enter the timescale of the Earth. And in a recent lecture, Benjamin Bratton made a joke saying, in what we used to call the Anthropocene. So maybe in some ways we can bookend that decade. And I think this is helpful. Nevertheless, I don't think the painted protest trope, lens necessarily helps us understand that much about what this art and theory is doing or what it means. So what I think can help us actually a little bit more is to think about it in the context of the changing technological and mediatic environment that it came from. I think we need to situate the painted protest within a transforming landscape, a transforming urban landscape that's increasingly becoming cybernetic. Right? So let me shift gears a little bit to do that and talk about cybernetics. So cybernetics, is a theme that was very much discussed probably a decade ago, but has been less so recently, despite the fact that we have entered into an ever more cybernetic environment in the last decade. Originally, the term it actually is used in Plato's dialogue, The Statesman, to describe steering. That's what the word means in Greek, kubernesis, to steer, good at steering, and it refers actually to a helmsman with the abilities to actually navigate a ship on choppy waters and to steer a crew as well. But more recently, the term is developed by Norbert Wiener, the famous cybernetician in the mid-20th century, to describe how systems, not man, but systems, conceived as human-machine interactions, self-regulate through negative feedback to maintain order and balance. In Wiener's work, which was first-order cybernetics, systems were conceptualized as closed, predictable, and driven by a tendency towards homeostasis. And the analogy there was from the servo mechanism and how it stabilized itself. In second-order cybernetics, which develops later in the work of people like Heinz von Forster in the 70s, Stafford Beer, and Varela, second-order cybernetics transforms this into open systems. So instead of a closed system that self-regulates homeostatically, we have open, complex, dynamic, emergent systems in which the observer is integrated into the environment, into the system, and effects are viewed as unpredictable and dynamic. Right? In the work of thinkers like Gregory Bateson, also operating in the 1970s, cybernetics was applied to the whole of society and even conceptualized society as an organism. So Bateson, actually in many ways foreshadowing the thinking that I was describing before with people like Anna Singh and Bruno Latour, Bateson had a very, very dramatic critique of the Western metaphysical conception of the subject and object relationship, the relationship between the human and the world. And in diagrams like these, he tried to argue that this hubristic figure of the Western individual was responsible for steering the Earth towards catastrophe, towards pollution, towards famine, towards war, and ultimately towards potentially environmental collapse. So his argument was that we need to take cybernetics and apply it to understanding society as a living organism. And he had this concept of mind in his book, Steps to an Ecology of Mind, where he describes cybernetic systems as analogous to how the nervous system coordinates responses in an organism. And he said, if we continue to operate in terms of a Cartesian dualism of mind versus matter, we shall probably also continue to see the world in terms of God versus man, elite versus people, chosen race versus others, nation versus nation, and man versus environment. We have to move to a concept of mind, by which I mean the whole system, the whole complex of ideas, the whole patterned arrangement of the communicational and organizational structure of the universe, which includes you and me and the telephone and the constellations. So the cybernetic shift, inaugurated by people like Norbert Wiener, Bateson, and von Forster, is what is referred to as a silent revolution, because it restructured nearly every field in the 60s and 70s and 80s and beyond. In ecology, C.S. Halling developed the idea of resilience, which has since now become the dominant approach in urban planning and design. Isabel Stengers and Priogene emphasize dissipative processes, the idea of order arising from chaos. We have the Limits to Growth report from the Club of Rome in 1972. We even have an attempt to reconceptualize and redesign cities starting in the 1960s and 70s around cybernetic principles so that they can function as self-regulating technological and social organisms. So cybernetics entailed a shift not just in how the world was represented, but in how selfhood is understood, operationalized, constructed, and experienced. Essentially, what it envisioned is the disintegration of the subject into feedback loops and sensing nodes, which is also going to involve the dissolving of the subject into its communicative environment. So rather than an individual that acts upon a world, instead you have the subject understood as a node for feedback through which communication and information flows. This is the cybernetic understanding of the subject. We see things begin to really jump scale with the cybernetic, transformation of our environment in the 2010s and 2020s, exactly the period that I've been describing of the rise of climate change and ecology-related art and the painted protest. This period marks the rise of social media as the dominant discourse space, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and so on, as well as the increased embedding of smart city feedback loops into urban environments. You have the pioneering of the smart city by IBM in the 2010s, but then what really defines the last decade much more profoundly is the deepening and maybe realizing of the cybernetic vision of networked organization and its implications for the subject. In a really great talk given recently, the media theorist Caroline Busta said the real thesis of our time is understanding that we have moved into a dramatically new and different media ecosystem, communication system that is really dissolving the boundaries of the subject and transforming subjecthood, and yet we're still operating with a sense of the subject from another media environment. She says, the central thesis really is that the world you grew up in no longer exists, as the meme has it. And so this has been transforming, this shift toward a cybernetic mode of communication is really transforming the urban environment. And this context is very disruptive for the individual. Shifting subjectivity from an autonomous, self-contained individual towards a networked relational self that is modulated rather than created through data traces, digital interactions, and algorithmic mediation and feedback loops. What we are really living through, I think, in the last decade has been the shift from the figure of the autonomous subject, capable of reason, agency, abstraction, orientation towards transcendence, and toward a human that is more a collective, an assemblage, a node, right? Okay, so back to the art in ecology and climate change. I think we have to understand that art, looking at impending climate chaos, envisioning entanglement with the more than human, emerged from within that new mediatic environment, that new technological environment. And it moved in a particular way because it came from that environment. And it took on, I think, it's a particular form because it came from that environment. We can understand it maybe best by looking at the concept of the network swarm from the writer John Robb. He's a military analyst who also dissects the technological reshaping of culture. And he recently, in an essay called The Future of War, observed, quote, "We don't live in a physical environment anymore. We live inside a network technosphere." And he says, in this context, war is transforming. And so he describes the concept of network tribalism, which is the formation and contagion of tightly connected, ideologically aligned online groups that function like digital tribes. Facilitated by social media, these groups form around shared beliefs, grievances, and identities, and reinforce their existing worldview through echo chambers and algorithmic filtering. Unlike traditional tribes based on geography or kinship network tribes are globally distributed but emotionally and cognitively cohesive, sort of. As he puts it, quote, "The network swarm wants to tame the technosphere by using it to aggressively eliminate everything they see as a threat. Racism, sexism, colonialism, fascism, etc. When it sees a threat, or we might add, thinks it sees a threat, or is told it sees a threat. It rapidly mobilizes using empathy triggers to amplify the danger posed by the threat and gain or coerce support for network controls to prevent it from reoccurring in the future. Online, the swarm fights through moral warfare. It does this by using the network to amplify the menace of new threats, which creates widespread fear and anxiety, an environment of widespread fear and anxiety, to force people to act cohesively and forcibly, usually by imposing limits and restrictions to oppose it. The more threatening the danger, the larger and faster the response. The moral axis of the swarm has three parts: equalization, transhumanism, and safeness. I think we can understand what I had previously called the apparatus of climate change and ecology-related art as a networked swarm. Right? So what we see is that, in some sense, these narratives and imaginaries that circulated across art, theory, and journalism really exhibit all the hallmarks of a network swarm's kind of decentralized form of coordination. High responsiveness, pattern replication without central command, effective contagion, and real-time adaptability, with the aim of overwhelming existing narratives and figures. Outlets like The Guardian circulate images such as these, which are Anastasia Samoilova's famous Miami photographs of flooded buildings. These are reproduced in articles in newspapers. These are reproduced in exhibitions. And I'll go through some other examples in just a second. But what we can see is that the way that these things circulate is that journalists and media pieces and artworks don't function exactly as agents of critique, even as Yates McKee might have put it, right? But they act more like active nodes in a recursive cultural algorithm, both online and IRL, feeding and amplifying and reinforcing one another's signals, each producing, responding to, and intensifying the language and imaginary of ecological crisis, Western man as villain, and humbled, horizontal, entangled life as response. So in a sense, this is like the swarmification of the apparatus. Like if Foucault described the apparatus in the 1970s and 80s as this assemblage of these different statements and visuals and practices, we see the swarmification, like the setting in motion of an apparatus in the way that terms and languages and images circulate and reinforce and amplify one another. So we might think of how The Guardian in 2019 made, like specific policies, editorial policies for using hyperbolic and like catastrophic language to describe climate change as a policy for all of its writers, and then produce articles that look like this, that we all have seen the real world effects of here in Miami. Miami is fucked, it's drowning, it's going to be gone in a couple of decades. This kind of, we have a lot of writers sort of amplifying these tropes. I'm scared, we should be scared. So on. Circulating podcasts are produced. Pieces on climate art as an educational tool, art used as an educational tool in classrooms. Then these circulate and feedback with reports projecting the economic impacts of flooding, visualizations that depict future inundation based on climate models, which are hypotheses. Goodbye Miami. This, and we see what's very interesting in these media pieces that incorporate artwork and aesthetic visualizations of inundation. These then recursively have fed back into the transformation of the physical built environment, in the sense that in Miami, for example, these pieces that came out around 2013, around the same time as Latour's essay, by the way, these pieces, Goodbye Miami, were seen as very strong signals for city governments here for building resilience, because these pieces were seen as threats to credit ratings for the city and credit, Moody's, agencies that rate bonds and credits for the city, look at climate action now and perceptions of climate action, and even media pieces on climate action or lack thereof in cities as determinant for their ratings for a city. So in other words, if Miami didn't build resiliency adaptation infrastructure, and these kinds of pieces were more and more published, Moody's would downgrade the credit rating for Miami. So circularly, these kinds of pieces drove the building of resiliency infrastructure in Miami and in many other cities, right? So the hype generated by these actually has produced real-world infrastructural interventions. Okay, climate projections, these are all circulating together. Social media about the artwork then reinforces some of the discourses. So this is the Daniel Lai's exhibition at the New Museum that I had mentioned earlier. We see the social media representation of it, describing it like this. Daniel Lai's 2022 New Museum exhibition turned the lobby gallery into a living ecosystem. No metaphor, just real time. Flowers dying, fungi arriving, spirits welcomed, human ego checked at the door. So we see how implicitly this sort of like need to humble the individual, the Western subject, is kind of built into the social media around these works as well. We see this kind of social media online swarming with the, kind of very emotional statements and memes. Greta Thunberg's like, how dare you? And ultimately, I think some of this, this discourse and these imaginaries really like coalesce in militant expressions in the far left, actually, which is very interesting. You find a repetition of the very same themes in the Invisible Committee's 2015 book, To Our Friends. And as they say, I think it's worth quoting at length. When one asks the left of the left what the revolution would consist in, it's quick to answer, placing the human at the center. What the left doesn't realize is how tired of the human the world is, how tired of humanity we are, of that species that thought it was the jewel of creation, that believed it was entitled to ravage everything since everything belonged to it. Placing the human at the center was the Western project, and we know how that turned out. The time has come to jump ship, to betray the species. There is no humanity. There are only earthlings and their enemies, the Occidentals of whatever skin color they happen to be. We revolutionaries, with our atavistic humanism, would do well to inform ourselves about the uninterrupted uprisings by the indigenous peoples of Central and South America over the past 20 years. Their watchword could be, place the earth at the center. It's a declaration of war against man. Declaring war on him could be the best way to bring him down to earth, if only he didn't play deaf as always. So, Latour rephrased here in more militant words. But really, this all reaches a crescendo in the actual attacks on artworks, artworks from the Western canon. So we saw over the last decade as well this these groups, Extinction Rebellion and like Just Stop Oil, physically attacking works. I think the first one was 2019. Oops, I don't have that picture here. I'll show it in a second. Attack in 2019 on the Mona Lisa. Then in 2022, last generation activists threw black oily liquid at Klimt's Life and Death here. There were a series of these that sort of replicated and were memed online as well, throwing pea soup at Van Gogh paintings and so on. Right. I'll come back to this in a second because it was quite crazy. Eventually, we saw a sort of a mutation of this discourse and this meme in the COVID moment during lockdowns when we had artworks being produced about the need to stay at home in the service of the bigger project, which also framed things as a matter of Mother Nature is upset with us, as this Vince Frost poster put it. Mother Nature is upset with us and it sent us all to our rooms for timeout. We saw this as a punishment for how badly we treated the earth. The forced time at home made us stop and think, et cetera. So COVID was often in the early days portrayed in artworks, both as the revenge of nature upon the human, right? And the necessary response being to put the human away, like stay in your house. Nature is healing without us, right? So these some more images of the climate activists destroying the works of art. So why do I have these here? Well, it's a little out of order because I want to say something about what I think is happening. I'll come back to those. So essentially, what we see in this time is that we have an increasingly cybernetic environment where communication is functioning in different ways. This is both online in platforms and things like that, but it also is shaping the behavior IRL of real people and real interactions and real production of works and writing. And I think that what we might want to consider is both that environment shaped the kind of work that was produced, the ideas that were being produced, the imaginaries that were being produced, but also that work contributed to the production of an imaginary itself. It contributed to the production of this imaginary of climate catastrophe, right? Of this vision of the world without us, the future without us. And this is, again, Domingo Castillo's film, Tropical Malaise. What he's actually showing in this film, and this is the reason why I think it's such a great film, he's showing the back end of these images of the inundated city, the future without us, the city without us, as being produced through the same rendering software that creates architectural designs like urban developments, right? So what we saw was actually the production of the climate apocalypse imaginary. Not a pre-existing thing, right? But the production of it. And with it, I think, also new tools for the cyberneticization of our lives. New tools, conceptual tools, in the form of an avant-garde theory of entangled life, an anti-human, humbled vision of life as interconnected through feedback loops that was produced through these artworks, through this theory, as the necessary way of living to overcome climate crisis, right? So in sense, okay, let me just sum this up. In other words, climate art and theory emerged from a cyberneticizing environment, and also produced a new powerful imaginary that contributes to and augments that environment's development. Right? And I think that we might want to consider climate art and ecology-related art in that context, right? A little bit differently than we tend to. Instead of just works that are communicating pre-existing facts, right? Actually a response to a very deep transformation of the individual, right? And I think in some ways, you know, we have to consider that this is a very disruptive experience. To become feedback loops, to become nodes through which information flows, is a very disruptive, deranging experience for the human being, right? And I think that, you know, we see these very crazy looking outpourings of an expression of that experience, maybe, right? I mean, like some of these protests were people. This guy on the bottom left, like he's gluing his head to the painting, and then his friend there is like dumping tomato soup on his head while he's attached to the painting. You know, I think these are sort of images of this derangement of the subject undergoing a radical, you know, cybernetic alteration of itself, the bounds of itself. And we might consider this, you know, as an experience that we're still living through in many ways. Writing in 1995, Paul Virilio was talking about cyberspace, a term we don't even really use anymore. And he was saying, you know, the entering into a cybernetic environment is perhaps going to cause a great accident. He foresaw a catastrophe coming with the entrance into cyberspace. He says, what lies ahead is a disturbance in the perception of what reality is. It's a shock, a mental concussion. And this outcome ought to interest us. Why? Because never has any progress in a technique been achieved without addressing its specific negative aspects. The specific negative aspect of these information superhighways is precisely this loss of orientation regarding alterity, the other, this disturbance in the relationship with the other and with the world. It's obvious that this loss of orientation, this non-situation, is going to usher a deep crisis which will affect society. And so what I want to suggest is that, you know, maybe the last decade and the way in which we have seen this kind of delirious circulation of, you know, very dramatic affects, very dramatic visualizations of crisis and a world that we are about to lose or that maybe we're already losing, as well as the painted protest, right? The very violent kind of like emotional hysteria of art and culture over the last decade with call-outs and Me Too and these kind of like, you know, attempt to pinpoint some kind of scapegoat going on here. I think we can see this as maybe the accident that Virilio was describing, this outpouring of individuals very disrupted by this new environment. Very, very deranged by this new environment. So maybe this is the climate change that's actually being described or expressed by this kind of art and theory. Just, this is a hypothesis. So I'm going to wrap up now. The problem with the cybernetic environment and the problem with entangled life, as it's being conceived, is that it poses a flattening of life, of existence. It poses a homogenizing of life and existence. It claims and it tells us that there is no possibility of transcendence, of other ways of living, of a vertical ascent for life. Life becomes feedback loops. We become pure points of passage through which information flows, through which we pass on without question, right? The danger is a reduction of man to an insect, maybe, or a machine. And I think this is the image of life that's actually being promoted and called for in a lot of this work. So maybe we want to juxtapose something else against this. Instead of just mourning the world that we're losing and sort of embracing the new, the flattened reality that we're entering into, we might want to consider something else. And so I'm going to skip that. So the last thing I want to end on is a very different kind of art related to nature, back to Nicholas Roerich. This might seem like a really strange thing to end on. It might seem very out of time, but I think that's the point. So Nicholas Roerich is not necessarily an artist that's discussed very much right now. He spent much of his life, traversing the Himalayas in Central Asia, producing hundreds upon hundreds of paintings of mountains, skies, and otherworldly landscapes. These were not representations of the environment or calls for awareness or educational tools. They were meditations on ascent, both the spiritual and metaphysical elevation of the human being, but also of real-life adventure. So he produced a lot of these paintings on very wild expeditions himself. For example, between 1923 and 1928, Roerich, accompanied by his wife, his son, and a team of scholars and assistants, led an expedition to document the archaeological, cultural, and spiritual landscapes of Central Asia. Officially, this was a cultural and scientific expedition to study the archaeology, archaeology, the plants and religions of Central Asia. But not just about collecting archaeological or botanical specimens. The expedition was also, more unofficially, an esoteric spiritual mission to locate the city of Shambhala. Nestled deep within the formidable embrace of the Himalayas, Shambhala is a legendary mythical kingdom in the Tibetan Buddhist tradition. It's described as a technologically advanced city of light, a sanctuary of serenity and splendor, shielded by jagged, snow-draped peaks. Described as a vision of earthly opulence. Palaces are crafted from rare stones and gleaming gold, adorned with precious gems and vibrant corals. Its landscapes are dotted with serene lakes where inhabitants sail in jewel-carved boats. Shambhala is not a place of material wealth, but of spiritual heights, where every resident is destined to attain enlightenment within a single lifetime. And it embodies in myth and in stories a perfect harmony of prosperity and spiritual fulfillment. Texts circulating in the 20s that Roerich and his wife and many others were reading prophesied that Shambhala would be an eternal beacon of peace and it would launch a new era of light through a war, actually, through a spiritual war. Roerich and his wife were very obsessed with this city and they believed that it was real. And so they planned this expedition to locate it. This was a crazy hubristic expedition, actually, a really mad one by our contemporary definitions of what is normal or what's considered, possible even to do. Their goal was to find the city, locate it by traversing the mountains and make contact with spiritual authorities there and maybe even help usher in a new era of peace and light and spiritual greatness. They were supported financially by American philanthropists, the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture, and logistical aid from the Soviet government. Like I said, it's a mission that's very hard for us to imagine today. This is the kind of landscape that they're traversing, much of it actually unmapped at the time. They produced a lot of the first maps of it. They slept intense that looked like this. They had ice blindness from the landscape. They were equipped with art supplies for Rorich's paintings, firearms, and field glasses for protection against animals and bandits, medical provisions including treatments for altitude sickness and infection, tense blankets and coins and fabrics for trade, food rations and fuel. They traveled on caravans of horses, camels, and yaks, mules, sometimes using vehicles that would just fail on the rugged terrain. They covered vast distances, over 15,000 miles, across 35 mountain passes, mapping some of them for the first time, like I said, through an incredibly diverse range of environments and climates and incredibly harsh environmental conditions. Avalanches, flash floods, poisonous grass, temperatures below 94 degrees Celsius. They even fell out of contact with the outside world for a year. And no one fully knows what happened to them during that year. Rorich's life of adventure and this expedition obviously contrasts with the vision of life that we are now said we should follow. It was hubristic. It was physically very strenuous. It disregarded vulnerability and risk. In fact, walked right into those things. He, in fact, led another expedition to find the city of Shambhala again a few years later. So he continued and continued. But these paintings, I think, also speak to the central kind of philosophical and spiritual problem of cybernetics. The contrast between the man-nature assembly in Rorich's work and that of the climate and ecology apparatus is not just a matter of imagery or tone, but a reflection of a deeper philosophical divide, which is articulated by Peter Sloterdijk, the philosopher Peter Sloterdijk, in his work on verticality and anthropotechnics in the book You Must Change Your Life. For Sloterdijk, human greatness, which is exceptional, not the norm, is defined by vertical efforts, by the striving to rise above the given, the factical, to train the self, to cultivate distinction in the arena, as it were. These efforts are, in Sloterdijk's view, anthropotechnical, and they're achieved through intense discipline, through quests, through practice, and technological exteriorization. In Sloterdijk's description, this process is that through which humans leave their base camps of ordinary existence and ascend, quote, the mountains of improbability. As he says, the deep plays are those which are moved by the heights. For Sloterdijk, modernity is, it represents the mounting loss of this vertical dimension, a flattening sort of descent into the logistical, which I think we see now in climate and ecology art and in cybernetics in its denunciation of the Western hubristic Promethean ambition and the embrace of feedback loops and entanglement. So what we have now is a horizontal ontology, network systems and feedbacks. The resilient subject, the cybernetic subject, is not one who climbs, but one who adapts, not one who overcomes, but who copes. And this shift, this shift has led to really significant impacts on us and what we think is possible. We are told increasingly there is no other world, there are no other possibilities beyond this entanglement. But I think this is a lie. I think it's false. I think that Rorich maybe shows us a little bit is the need to actually embark on another quest, to consider what forms of life, what maybe even higher forms of life are possible from within this cybernetic environment that we now inhabit. What other cities are even possible within this flattened environment, rather than accepting like a swarm the statements that tell us that there is nothing else possible beyond this horizontal entanglement. I think we have to pursue a quest inspired by maybe images like these for what lies beyond, even the pillars of Hercules, right? What lies beyond for human life, even in the 21st century. Okay, thanks. I'm done.